The wind had teeth in this part of Nevada. It bit through the thin fabric of her dress, a relentless, scouring wind that carried the grit of the high desert and the scent of sagebrush and cold stone. It was a wind that promised nothing but emptiness, stretching for miles under a vast, indifferent sky the color of faded denim. The sun was a merciless hammer in that sky, beating down on the cracked earth and the shimmering steel tracks that cut a lonely path through the landscape. This ribbon of steel was her only hope. The freight train clattered and groaned, a serpent of iron and steam slithering east. It wasn't moving fast. Not yet, still laboring to pull its weight away from the last dusty outpost that passed for a town. But it was moving fast enough that her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, fast enough that the decision, once made, could not be undone. She ran alongside it, her worn-out boots stumbling on the loose scree of the railbed. Her lungs burned, each breath a searing gasp of hot, dusty air. The sounds of the world had narrowed to three things: the frantic drumbeat of her own blood in her ears, the rhythmic, metallic chant of the wheels' getaway, 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 and the shouts, faint but growing closer, angry. Male shouts that sliced through the wind and found her like arrows. They were looking for her. They would not stop looking. Her eyes fixed on the last car, an open-topped cattle car, blessedly empty save for the straw and dust coating its floor. It was her last chance. She gathered the last dregs of her strength, a final, desperate surge born of pure terror. Her fingers, raw and scraped, clawed at the iron ladder bolted to the side. The rough metal bit into her palms, but she held on, her body swinging out precariously as her feet left the ground. For one terrifying moment, she dangled, the grinding wheels a blur of motion just inches from her boots. Then, with a sob of effort, she hauled herself up, wrung by painful wrung, and tumbled over the edge, landing in a heap on the splintered floorboards. She lay there for a long time, gasping, every muscle screaming in protest. The straw pricked her cheek, smelling of dry grass and animal sweat. The floor vibrated beneath her, a steady, deep hum that seemed to travel up through her bones, a lullaby of escape. The shouts had faded, lost to the clatter of the train and the ever-present moan of the wind. She was away, for now. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself into a sitting position, pulling her knees to her chest and wrapping her arms around them. She was a small, huddled thing in the vastness of the car, her calico dress torn at the hem and stained with dust and sweat. Her hair, once neatly braided, had come loose, strands of pale blonde whipping across her face. She leaned her head back against the rough wall of the car, her eyes closed, and allowed herself one single, shuddering breath of relief. It was then she realized she was not alone. He was in the far corner, tucked into the shadows cast by the high wall of the car, and he was so still, so completely a part of the silence, that she hadn't seen him. He was a statue carved from the very grit and hardship of the land, a cowboy, from the looks of him. His hat was pulled low, obscuring much of his face, but she could see the hard line of his jaw, darkened with a day's worth of stubble, and the weathered texture of his skin. He was big, not just tall, but broad-shouldered, his frame filling out a dusty, long coat and worn denim. His hands, resting loosely on his knees, were large and calloused, the hands of a man who worked with rope and wood and iron. He wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the passing landscape, a blur of gray-green sage and reddish rock under the afternoon sun. There was a stillness about him that was unnerving, the kind of profound quiet that comes from long hours spent with no company but your own thoughts and the sky. Yet she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that he had seen everything. He had seen her desperate run, her clumsy scramble up the ladder, her pathetic collapse onto the floor. He had watched it all and had not moved a muscle. had not made a sound. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the fragile bubble of her relief. She had escaped one danger only to run headlong into another. What kind of man sat silently in the back of a freight car, watching a lone girl climb aboard? Her mind raced, cataloging the possibilities, each one more grim than the last. He could be a drifter, an outlaw, a man with no more regard for her life than for a stray dog on the road. He could be waiting for the train to get further out into the nowhere, where no one would hear her scream. She pressed herself further against the wall, trying to make herself smaller, invisible. She watched him from under her lashes, tracking his every non-movement. The train rattled and swayed, a constant, jarring motion. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in strokes of orange and purple. The air grew cooler, and still, he did not move. He just sat, a silent sentinel in his corner, his face a mask of stone. She didn't know how long they sat like that. Two silent figures at opposite ends of the car, separated by a gulf of fear and uncertainty. The world outside was a hypnotic, repeating vista of desert. Her initial terror began to subside, worn down by sheer physical and emotional exhaustion. It was replaced by a deep, aching weariness. Her body hurt, her mind hurt, and her soul felt scraped raw. What did it matter who he was? She had nowhere else to go. The men behind her were a certain kind of doom. This man, this silent stranger, was only a possible one. In the grim arithmetic of her life, that felt like an improvement. Slowly, hesitantly, she shifted. The movement was small, but in the charged silence, it felt as loud as a gunshot. His head turned, just slightly. He didn't lift it, didn't push back his hat, but she felt his eyes on her now, a direct, assessing gaze from beneath the brim. She couldn't see their color, but she could feel their weight. They weren't leering or cruel. They were just watching. There was a weariness in them that seemed to mirror her own, a deep, unsettling sadness that resonated with the hollow space in her own chest. His gaze held her, and she found she couldn't look away. It was as if he were looking right through her torn dress and her dirty skin, past the fear and the desperation, and seeing the terrified, frantic heart of her. He saw a creature on the run, and in his stillness, there was not judgment, only a quiet, unnerving recognition. She knew she had to do something, say something. The silence was a living thing now, growing heavier with each passing mile. To remain quiet felt like surrender. She had to know what he intended. She had to try and claim some small piece of control over her own fate. Drawing on a reserve of courage she didn't know she possessed, she began to move. Not away from him, but towards him. She crawled, unable to trust her shaking legs to hold her. The rough floorboard scraped her knees through the thin cotton of her dress, but she barely felt it. She moved slowly, like an animal approaching a fire, drawn by a need for safety but terrified of being burned. She stopped a few feet away from him, sitting back on her heels. She was close enough now to see the details of his face, the fine lines etched around his eyes from squinting into the sun, a thin, white scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the grim set of his mouth. He looked like a man who had forgotten how to smile. If he had ever known. He smelled of dust, leather, and something else, something faintly metallic like old blood or rust. He watched her approach without a word. His expression did not change. His hands remained resting on his knees. He offered no encouragement, but he made no move to stop her, either. She huddled there, trembling, the wind whipping her hair into her eyes. The last of the sun's light was fading, and the shadows in the car were growing long and deep, turning his corner into a cave of darkness. The full weight of her desperate situation crashed down on her. She was alone, friendless, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a secret that could get her killed. She was at the complete mercy of this silent, hard-faced man. Her voice, when it finally came, was a reedy whisper, barely audible above the noise of the train. It was cracked and raw with thirst and fear. She looked at the unmoving shape of him, a dark mountain of a man, and she gambled everything on the faint glimmer of sorrow she had seen in his eyes. "Don't let them catch me." His silence was a physical thing, a weight in the cooling air that pressed down on her. Clara remained on her knees, the echo of her own desperate whisper seeming to hang between them. She had thrown her last shred of hope at the feet of this stranger, and he had not even flinched. He simply sat, his face an unreadable landscape of shadows beneath his hat's brim, his gaze fixed somewhere on the darkening horizon. The train rocked and swayed, its rhythm the only answer she received. A cold dread began to seep into her bones, a dread far worse than the fear that had propelled her here. It was the icy certainty of being utterly, irrevocably alone. He had heard her, she knew he had, but his refusal to acknowledge her plea was a kind of damnation. She had been foolish to think a man like him, a man who seemed to be carved from the same unforgiving rock as the mountains they passed, would offer sanctuary. He was simply another feature of this harsh landscape, and she was just a tumbleweed blown into his path, of no more consequence than the dust that settled on his shoulders. She bowed her head, the fight draining out of her, leaving a hollow ache of resignation. She would wait. When the train slowed for water or a crossing, she would slip away again, back into the darkness, back to the running. The moon began to rise, a pale, scarred coin in the inky sky. It offered little light, only enough to turn the world outside into a ghostly panorama of silhouetted mesas and skeletal-looking Joshua trees. The air grew sharp with a cold that promised frost by morning. Shivers racked her body, not just from the chill, but from the deep, bone-wearying exhaustion that had finally taken root. The sound that broke the rhythm of the night was not from the train itself. It was a grating scrape of metal on metal, followed by a heavy thud of boots landing on the floorboards at the far end of the car. Clara's head snapped up. Her heart seized, a painful, violent clench in her chest. 3 figures stood silhouetted against the pale moonlight, their forms bulky and menacing. They had climbed up from a car further down the line. Even from this distance, she could smell them, the sour stench of sweat and cheap whiskey that seemed to cling to them like a shroud. They paused for a moment, letting their eyes adjust to the gloom, their low, guttural chuckles carrying on the wind. They were here. They had found her. Panic, stark and absolute, erased all other thought. Her muscles screamed at her to run, to hide, to somehow make herself vanish. But there was nowhere to go. She was caged. She scrambled backward on her hands and knees, crab-like, until her back hit the rough wall of the car. Her breath came in ragged, silent sobs. She could feel a scream building in her throat, a raw, terrified sound that she choked down with all her might. To scream was to give them the satisfaction. One of the men stepped forward. He was a big, barrel-chested man with a lumbering gait. A greasy bowler hat was perched on his head, and the moonlight caught the unpleasant shine of his smile. She recognized him. His name was Silas, and his touch was like spiders crawling on her skin. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice a coarse rumble. "Look what we have here, a little lost lamb, all by her lonesome." His 2 companions fanned out behind him, cutting off any imagined escape. They were smaller, wirier men, faces lost to the shadows, but their presence was just as threatening. They moved with a predator's ease, confident and cruel. Silas took another step, his eyes fixed on her, savoring her terror. "Gave us quite a run, girl. But the world ain't as big as you think. Time to come back home. The boss is displeased." Clara pressed herself harder against the wood, the splinters digging into her back. Her gaze darted from Silas to the other 2. Then, in a last, hopeless appeal, to the cowboy in the corner. He hadn't moved. He was still sitting, a silent statue of a man. It was as if the other men weren't even there. For a horrifying moment, she thought he would do nothing. He would simply watch. Her last, foolish gamble had failed. Then he shifted. It was not a large movement. It was economical, precise, and utterly commanding. He didn't stand. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply uncrossed his legs and leaned forward slightly, bringing himself more fully into the pale moonlight. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached out and took hold of the edge of his long, canvas duster. He didn't look at her, but he flicked his wrist, and the heavy fabric unfurled, settling over her huddled form, covering her from her shoulders to her knees. The coat enveloped her in a pocket of relative darkness. It smelled of horse, leather, and the clean scent of the night air. It was heavy, a tangible weight on her shaking shoulders. And for a reason she couldn't comprehend, it felt like an anchor in the swirling vortex of her fear. He had hidden her, or rather, he had claimed her. He had drawn a line in the dust with the hem of his coat. Silas stopped his advance, his sneer faltering. His attention, which had been so possessively focused on Clara, now shifted to the man in the corner. The air in the car grew thick and heavy, charged with a new, dangerous current. "This ain't your concern, friend," Silas said, his voice losing some of its confident swagger. He tried to peer around the cowboy, to get a better look at Clara hidden beneath the coat. The cowboy, Weston, did not reply. He didn't even seem to be breathing. He simply lifted his head, and for the first time, the moonlight fell fully on his face. His hat still cast a deep shadow, but it could not hide the glacial stillness of his features or the intensity of his eyes. "I said," Silas repeated, taking a half-step forward, trying to reassert his dominance. "This is between me and the girl. Step aside." Weston's gaze locked with his, and Clara, watching from her shelter, felt the temperature in the train car drop by 20 degrees. It was a look unlike any she had ever seen on a human face. There was no anger in it, no fury. Anger was a hot, messy emotion. This was cold. It was the cold of a deep well, the cold of a razor's edge, the cold of a winter grave. It was a look of absolute and final certainty. It stripped away all of Silas's bluster and bravado and laid bare the soft, pathetic thing underneath. It was a look that didn't just threaten violence. It promised an efficient, passionless, and utterly devastating end. It was the look of a man who had been to the darkest places a man could go and had come back with nothing left to lose and even less to fear. It said, without a single word, "You have made a mistake. You can either walk away from it now, or you can be buried with it." Silas physically recoiled. It wasn't a conscious step back, it was an involuntary flinch, the reaction of a man who had put his hand on a hot stove. His face, which had been flushed with arrogance, went pale. The greasy smile vanished. He had come looking for a scared girl and had found himself staring into the eyes of a wolf, a quiet, patient, and very old wolf. He swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. He glanced at his two companions, but they offered no support. They were frozen, their own cheap confidence evaporated by the sheer, silent force of the man in the corner. They had seen the same thing he had. They had looked into the abyss, and it had looked back. For a long, stretched-out moment, nobody moved. The only sounds were the clatter of the wheels and the lonely cry of the train's whistle in the distance. The standoff was a silent battle of wills, and Silas was utterly, hopelessly outmatched. He broke first. He averted his gaze, looking down at the dusty floorboards as if they held some sudden, fascinating secret. He cleared his throat, a rough, grating sound. "No need for trouble," he mumbled, his voice now a mere shadow of its former self. He wouldn't look at Weston again. He couldn't, just a misunderstanding. He turned, not walking but shuffling, his bravado lying in tatters around him. "Come on," he grunted at his men, and without another word, the three of them retreated to the far end of the car. There was another scrape and a thud, and then they were gone, swallowed back into the night from which they came. Silence descended once more, but it was a different kind of silence. The oppressive weight of fear was gone, replaced by a strange, humming stillness. Clara remained huddled under the heavy coat, her heart still pounding but no longer with terror. It was pounding with a disbelieving awe. She had just witnessed a man win a fight without moving more than a few inches, without raising his voice, without showing a single weapon. He had faced down 3 armed men with nothing but the force of his presence, the unnerving power of his stillness. He had protected her. Slowly, Weston retracted his coat, the fabric sliding from her shoulders as he settled back into his corner. His posture once again relaxed and distant. He returned his gaze to the passing landscape as if nothing had happened, as if 3 men hadn't just boarded his car intent on violence. Clara stared at his profile, the hard line of his jaw, the quiet set of his mouth. He was a complete stranger. He didn't know her story, didn't know her past, didn't know the reason those men were after her. He didn't even know her name. And a profound, staggering realization washed over her. So clear and so powerful, it felt like the sun rising after a long, dark night. He didn't need to. The departure of Silas and his men did not bring peace, but a new, more complicated tension. The immediate threat was gone, but its shadow lingered, long and cold in the moonlight. Clara remained huddled against the wall, the ghost warmth of Weston's coat still clinging to her shoulders. She watched him, this silent bastion who had shielded her without a word. He had returned to his vigil, his profile a stoic silhouette against the passing landscape, as if the violent confrontation had been nothing more than a flicker in a long, quiet dream. Hours crawled by. The moon arced across the sky, its light shifting through the slats of the cattle car, creating a moving cage of silver and black. The train rattled on, a relentless metronome marking the passage of time and distance. Clara did not sleep. Her exhaustion was a leaden weight in her limbs, but her mind was a whirlwind. Who was this man? Where did he come from? And where was he going? He was no simple ranch hand. The cold authority he had displayed was not born of herding cattle. It was something harder, something forged in a fire she could only guess at. She clutched the small, lumpy cloth pouch that was tied to her waist, its presence a constant, reassuring weight against her hip. It was all she had. It was everything. As the first hint of dawn began to bleed into the eastern sky, painting the horizon in bruised shades of purple and gray, the character of the land outside began to change. The flat, open desert gave way to a more rugged, broken country. The ground grew stonier, rising into sharp mesas and deep ravines. The train, which had maintained a steady, loping pace through the night, began to slow, its wheels screeching in protest as it navigated sharper curves. Clara felt a prickle of unease. The open desert had felt safe in its vastness. This broken terrain felt like a place of ambush, full of shadows and hiding spots. It was Weston who moved first. He didn't tense or startle, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, a sharpening of his stillness. His head tilted, as if listening to something beyond the clamor of the train. He rose to his feet in one fluid motion, a predator sensing a change in the wind. He moved to the side of the car, his hand resting on the top rail, and peered back the way they had come. Clara's blood ran cold. She scrambled to her feet, her own gaze following his. At first, she saw nothing but the long, curving tail of the train snaking behind them. Then, she saw them. Dust, a plume of it, rising against the pale dawn sky. Far back on a parallel ridge, it was a purposeful cloud, moving with a speed that was not natural, and at its heart, she could just make out the dark, bouncing shapes of horses and riders. No, she breathed, the word a small, broken thing. They had circled around. They had ridden hard through the night to cut them off. Weston said nothing. His jaw was a hard, tight line. He scanned the landscape ahead. His eyes narrowed, assessing, calculating. The train was approaching a high trestle bridge that spanned a wide, deep canyon. Below, a river, shrunken by the dry season, carved a path through the canyon floor, a green ribbon of willows and cottonwoods lining its banks. It was a dizzying drop. The riders were closing the distance with terrifying speed. She could see them more clearly now. 4 of them. Silas was in the lead, and he had a rifle cradled in his arm. They were no longer trying to be subtle. The train hit the trestle bridge, and the sound changed from a solid clatter to a hollow, echoing roar as the wheels rolled over the wooden ties. The wind howled up from the canyon floor, a mournful, hungry sound. Weston turned to her. His eyes, in the clear morning light, were the color of slate, and they held an electrifying intensity. He wasted no time on explanations or reassurances. "When I say so, you jump," he said. His voice was a low growl, not a request, but an absolute command. Clara's heart stopped. She stared at him, then at the terrifying drop. The canyon walls were a sheer cliff of crumbling rock and scree. "What we can't will be killed." "They'll kill you for sure if you stay," he countered, his gaze unwavering. He grabbed the front of her dress, his grip firm but not bruising. "You'll do exactly as I say. Keep your body loose. Understand?" A shot rang out, a sharp crack that echoed across the canyon. A splinter of wood exploded from the rail just inches from Weston's hand. He didn't even flinch. The riders were galloping alongside the train now, separated from them by nothing but 20 feet of empty, rushing air. Silas was raising his rifle for another shot. Now Weston roared. He didn't give her a choice. He wrapped one powerful arm around her waist, lifting her clean off her feet, and threw them both over the side. The world dissolved into a sickening, chaotic blur of sky and rock. The roar of the wind filled her ears, stealing the scream from her lungs. She had a fleeting, terrifying image of the river far, far below. She closed her eyes, bracing for the final, bone-shattering impact. But they didn't fall all the way. They hit the canyon slope with a brutal, jarring force that knocked the wind from her. Weston had angled their jump, aiming for the steep, scree-covered embankment just below the bridge's foundation. He took the brunt of the impact himself, his body shielding hers as they began to slide and tumble down the treacherous incline. It was a nightmare of pain and disorientation. Rocks, sharp and unforgiving, tore at their clothes and skin. The world was a grating, scraping, tumbling chaos. Dust filled her mouth and nose, choking her. She was a rag doll in his grip, his arm a band of iron around her, preventing them from separating and cartwheeling to their deaths. He used his heavy boots to dig into the loose rock, trying to control their descent, but it was like trying to stop an avalanche. They slid the last 20 feet, their momentum finally spent, and landed in a bruised, tangled heap in the scrub brush and sand at the canyon's bottom. For a long moment, there was only the sound of her own ragged gasping and the distant, fading rumble of the train. Every inch of her body screamed in agony. Her arms and legs were a tapestry of cuts and scrapes. Her head throbbed. Above them, on the bridge, the riders had stopped. They were shouting, their voices faint and distorted by the canyon's echoes. A few more shots rang out, but the bullets pinged harmlessly off the rocks high above them. They were out of sight. For now. Weston pushed himself up, groaning with effort. His face was streaked with dirt, and a trickle of blood ran from the scar on his eyebrow. But he seemed otherwise intact. He grabbed her arm and hauled her to her feet. "They'll come down," he said, his voice strained. "We have to move." He started to pull her towards the relative cover of the willows along the riverbank. Her legs felt like jelly, and she stumbled, every step in agony. It was in that moment of stumbling that she felt a sudden, horrifying lightness at her waist. Her pouch, the tie had torn in the fall. She looked down and saw it lying in the dust a few feet behind them, a pathetic, grimy bundle of cloth. "Wait!" she cried out, a raw, panicked sound. She pulled free from his grasp and lurched back towards it. All the pain, all the fear of the riders, vanished, replaced by a singular, all-consuming terror of losing that bag. It was her life. It was her purpose. It was the only thing that gave her frantic, desperate flight any meaning. "Leave it," Weston commanded, his voice sharp. "It's not worth your life." But she didn't listen. She dove for it, her fingers closing around the worn fabric just as her ankle twisted on a loose rock, sending a searing bolt of pain up her leg. She cried out, collapsing to the ground, but she clutched the pouch to her chest like a newborn child. In an instant, Weston was there. He swept her up, one arm under her knees, the other around her back, and half carried, half dragged her into the thicket of willows. He pushed her down behind a large boulder, pressing her into the cool, damp earth. He crouched beside her, his body shielding her from view, a revolver now appearing in his hand as if by magic. He peered through the leaves, watching the top of the canyon, his breathing low and steady. They stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, hidden in the green gloom, listening. The shouting from above eventually faded. The riders, realizing the difficulty and danger of coming down the steep slope, had apparently decided to ride on and find an easier path down. They were safe, but only for a moment. The adrenaline began to fade, and the pain returned with a vengeance. Clara cradled her throbbing ankle, tears of pain and relief streaming down her dirty cheeks. But she held the cloth pouch tight, its familiar weight a comfort against her frantic heart. Weston finally turned his attention from the canyon rim back to her. His slate-gray eyes traveled from her tear-streaked face, down to her injured ankle, and then settled on the dirty pouch she was guarding so fiercely. His expression was grim, impatient. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. He had just thrown himself off a moving train to save her, and she had risked both their lives for a bundle of rags. He deserved an answer. He holstered his revolver and leaned closer. "What's in there?" he asked, his voice low and devoid of any softness. What was worth dying for? Clara looked up at his hard, blood-streaked face, the man who protected her with silence, the man who had jumped with her into the abyss. He had earned more than an answer. He had earned the truth. She swallowed the lump in her throat, her voice barely a whisper against the gentle burble of the river. "Proof." The word hung in the quiet air of the canyon floor, heavy and resonant. "Proof." Weston's slate-gray eyes held hers for a long moment, searching. He didn't ask what it was proof of, or who it was for. The single word was enough. It explained the desperation, the frantic run, the willingness to risk her life for a bundle of papers. It spoke of a burden heavier than any physical weight. He seemed to absorb the word, to understand its implications in a way that went beyond mere language. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. The question was answered. The subject was closed. He rose and offered her a hand. "Can you walk?" Clara tested her ankle, wincing as a sharp, fiery pain shot up her leg. "I don't think so." Without another word, he knelt, turning his back to her. "Get on." She hesitated. The intimacy of the gesture was more startling than the jump from the train, but the alternative was being left behind. So she swallowed her apprehension, wrapped her arms around his neck, and allowed him to lift her. He rose to his feet with a grunt of effort, her meager weight seeming to be no great challenge for his strength, and began to walk. Their journey was a long, silent trial. Weston moved with a steady, ground-eating stride, following the meandering path of the river as it cut deeper into the wilderness. He knew this land. He moved through it not as a trespasser, but as someone who understood its rhythms and its secrets. He navigated the treacherous, rock-strewn banks with an unerring certainty, his boots finding purchase where Clara could see only loose shale and treacherous inclines. Clara, clinging to his back, felt every jarring step. Pain from her ankle was a constant, throbbing drumbeat. But worse than the pain was the silence. It stretched between them, thick and profound. She was pressed against the solid wall of his back, her cheek resting near the rough fabric of his shirt. She could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, the heat of his body, the powerful flex of his muscles with each step. It was a proximity born of pure necessity, yet it felt more revealing than any conversation. She watched the world go by over his shoulder. The canyon walls, so menacing from above, were now majestic, soaring pillars of red and ochre rock, streaked with veins of darker stone. Eagles circled high overhead in the vast, cloudless sky. The air smelled of damp earth, river water, and the faint, dusty scent of the man who carried her. This quiet, steady progress was the absolute antithesis of the frantic, chaotic violence of their morning. The world had slowed to the pace of a walking man. Hours bled into one another. The sun climbed high, beating down into the canyon, and Weston did not stop. He walked with a relentless, mechanical endurance that spoke of a life lived on the very edge of hardship. He was a creature of this unforgiving land, as tough and enduring as the ancient rock around them. Finally, as the afternoon sun began to dip towards the western rim of the canyon, he turned away from the river, heading towards a narrow, almost invisible fissure in the canyon wall. It looked like nothing more than a crack, a dead end. But as they drew closer, she saw it was the mouth of a smaller, hidden box canyon, its entrance choked with a thick stand of aspen and juniper. He pushed through the dense foliage, and the world changed. The air here was cooler, shielded from the direct sun. A small, clear spring trickled from the rock face, feeding a patch of impossibly green grass. Nestled against the far wall of this hidden sanctuary was a small, sturdy cabin built of rough-hewn logs, its stone chimney breathing a thin, lazy curl of smoke into the still air. Beside it stood a small, well-mended corral, currently empty, and a tilled garden patch where rows of beans and squash grew in defiance of the surrounding desert. The place was a secret, a haven carved directly from the wilderness. It was a place of deep, profound peace. As Weston stepped into the clearing, the cabin door swung open. A little girl stood framed in the doorway, a flash of bright calico and sun-bleached hair. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old. Her face was smudged with dirt and her feet were bare, but her eyes were as bright and clear as the spring water. "Weston," she cried, her voice a high, happy bell in the quiet canyon. She launched herself from the doorway and ran towards them, her small legs pumping, and Clara witnessed a transformation. The hard, stony mask that Weston wore seemed to dissolve. The grim line of his mouth softened, and the coldness in his eyes, the glacial hardness that had made Silas recoil in terror, melted away. It was replaced by a look of such profound, aching tenderness that it made Clara's breath catch in her throat. "Easy now, June," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble she scarcely recognized. He carefully knelt, allowing Clara to slide from his back onto the soft grass, before opening his arms to the little girl. June crashed into him, wrapping her arms around his neck in a fierce hug. He held her close, his large, calloused hand stroking her tangled hair. He buried his face in her shoulder for a moment, and Clara had the distinct feeling that she was intruding on something sacred, a private ritual of reunion. "Did you bring me anything?" June asked, pulling back to look at him, her expression a mix of hope and mischief. "I brought myself back. Ain't that enough?" he teased, his voice still soft. "Sometimes," she conceded seriously. Then her bright, curious eyes landed on Clara. The smile vanished from her face, replaced by a shy, wary apprehension. She edged closer to Weston, her small hand gripping the fabric of his shirt. "Who's she?" "She's a traveler," Weston said simply. "She's hurt her foot. She'll be staying with us a while." He looked at Clara, his gaze once again reserved, but the harsh edge was gone, softened by the child's presence. "This is my home for now. Girl, you'll be safe here." He carried Clara inside. The cabin was a single, clean room, sparsely furnished but well kept. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A simple table and 2 chairs sat in the center. In one corner was a large bed, neatly made, and in the other, a smaller cot that was clearly June's. Everything was practical, handmade, and bore the mark of quiet, solitary labor. He set her down gently in one of the chairs. "June, fetch me the water bucket and the clean rags from the chest." The little girl, her shyness momentarily forgotten in the face of a task, scurried to obey. Weston knelt before Clara, his touch surprisingly gentle as he examined her swollen ankle. "It's a bad sprain," he diagnosed, his fingers probing the tender flesh with an expert's care, "but not broken." June returned with the supplies, placing them on the floor beside him. She watched, her head cocked to one side, as Weston soaked a rag in the cool water and began to carefully clean the cuts and scrapes on Clara's leg. His hands, which Clara had seen as instruments of potential violence, were now impossibly gentle, his movements deft and careful as he worked. He wrapped her ankle tightly with a strip of clean cloth, his focus absolute. He finished his work and sat back on his heels. "You'll need to stay off it for a few days." He looked over at the little girl, who was now examining a fresh scrape on her own knee, a small, bloody mark from some earlier adventure. "Looks like you've been in the wars yourself." "June bug." June nodded solemnly. "I fell by the spring. A lizard surprised me." Weston's expression softened again into that deep well of tenderness. "Come here," he murmured. June hobbled over and stood before him, bravely presenting her wounded knee. Clara sat in silence, watching, feeling like a ghost in this small, domestic scene. Weston took the rag, rinsed it, and began to clean the little girl's scrape with the same methodical care he had shown Clara. But this time, it was different. He murmured to her as he worked, quiet words of comfort. He blew gently on the scrape to soothe the sting. When he was done, he pressed a light kiss to her forehead. And in that moment, watching the big, hard man tend to the small child with such exquisite gentleness, Clara understood. She saw the story not in what he said, but in the aching vulnerability in his eyes. This was not just the affection of a guardian for his charge. It was something more profound, something fiercely protective, born from a place of deep and terrible pain. This quiet life, this hidden sanctuary. This little girl, they were his penance, or perhaps his salvation. They were the center of his world, the reason he endured. She saw the ghosts in his eyes. She didn't know their names or what they looked like, but she recognized their shape. They were the same shape as the ghosts that haunted her. She realized, with a clarity that was both startling and deeply sad, that the fortress he had built around his heart was not there to keep the world out. It was there to keep a precious, fragile memory safe within. He had lost something, too, something or someone that had torn a hole in the center of his life, a hole he was now trying to fill with the quiet, fierce, and desperate love he poured into this little girl. The first few days were a blur of pain and sleep. Clara drifted in a haze. Her world shrunk to the confines of the small cot Weston had set up for her near the hearth. The constant, throbbing ache in her ankle was a fierce anchor to the present. But her mind often fled, replaying the terrifying jump from the train, the brutal tumble down the canyon wall. She would wake with a gasp, her heart hammering, the rough-hewn logs of the cabin ceiling slowly coming into focus, reassuring her that she was, for the moment, safe. Her world was measured by the movement of light and shadow across the cabin floor. In this quiet, hidden place, time seemed to move differently, marked not by the hands of a clock, but by the rhythm of a life pared down to its essentials. She learned the sound of Weston rising before dawn, the soft scrape of his boots on the floorboards, the quiet clink of the water dipper. She learned the smell of wood smoke as he started the fire, a scent that chased away the deep chill of the high desert night. And every morning, without fail, when she finally stirred and pushed herself into a sitting position, she would find it, a tin cup filled to the brim with cold, clear water from the spring, placed on the small, three-legged stool beside her cot. He never mentioned it. She never saw him place it there, It was simply a fact, a constant and silent gesture of care that was as reliable as the sunrise. She would drink it slowly, the cool water a balm to her dry throat, and feel a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the growing fire. June was her first bridge to this new life. After a day of cautious, wide-eyed observation, the little girl's natural curiosity won out over her shyness. She approached Clara's cot one afternoon, clutching a handful of long, dry grasses. "Weston says your foot is busted," she announced, her voice a serious whisper. Clara managed a small smile. "He's right about that." June considered this, then held out the fistful of grass. "Can you show me? Weston said you might know things. Pretty things." And so their routine began. While Weston was outside, his presence a steady, rhythmic percussion of work, the thud of a maul splitting firewood, the scrape of a shovel in the garden, the creak of leather as he mended a harness. Clara would sit with June on the cabin's small porch, her ankle propped on a stool. She taught the little girl the simple magic her own mother had taught her years ago. She showed her how to soften the dry blades of grass with her fingers, how to weave them, one over the other, into a sturdy braid. June was a rapt pupil, her small, sun-browned fingers, clumsy at first, grew more nimble with each passing day. She would sit for hours, her tongue poked out in concentration, her bright hair falling into her eyes, as she painstakingly crafted her creations. Their first efforts were lopsided and loose, but Clara praised them as if they were masterworks. Soon, they had a small collection of braided circles, which June called her prairie crowns. She wore one constantly, a slightly askew halo of golden grass in her hair. Through these long, quiet afternoons, Clara learned more about Weston than he would ever tell her himself. She learned it from the way June's face would light up when she heard his footsteps approaching. She learned it from the stories the little girl told, simple, childish anecdotes of him teaching her to track a rabbit, or pointing out the constellations in the vast, dark sky. She learned that he had a horse, a big roan named Dust Devil, that he kept pastured in a hidden meadow a mile up the canyon. She learned that he was the one who had patched June's dress with careful, if clumsy, stitches, and that he could make a surprisingly good stew from little more than beans and dried jerky. He remained a man of few words. Their conversations were brief, functional exchanges. More water is the pain bad. The fire's getting low. But Clara was beginning to learn his language. It was a language of action, not speech. A language written in a neatly stacked woodpile. In the clean bandage he replaced on her ankle each evening. In the way he would leave a plate of warm stew on the stool beside her before serving himself. He was a silent, formidable wall between her and the world that hunted her. And behind that wall, a tentative, fragile sense of peace began to take root in her heart. One afternoon, about a week into her stay, she felt strong enough to hobble outside on her own, using a sturdy branch Weston had carved into a crutch for her. She made her way slowly to the patch of green grass by the spring. The place felt magical, a secret garden in the heart of the stone desert. And there, growing near the water's edge, was a single, defiant wildflower. It was a small, delicate thing with petals the color of a twilight sky, a spot of impossible beauty in a world of muted browns and grays. On impulse, she leaned down and picked it. She held it for a long time, admiring its simple perfection. It felt like a symbol of this place, of the unexpected life and gentleness she had found here. Not knowing what else to do with it, she brought it back to the cabin and left it on the rough-hewn dinner table, its stem in a small puddle of water to keep it fresh. The next morning, it was gone. She assumed June had taken it, or that Weston, in his practical way, had simply tossed it out. She felt a small, foolish pang of disappointment, but quickly dismissed it. A few days later, Weston and June went out for the day, heading up the canyon to check on the horse. It was the first time Clara had been left completely alone in the cabin. The silence was immense, broken only by the buzz of a lazy fly and the distant call of a hawk. A strange restlessness came over her. This small room had been her sanctuary, but now it felt like a cage. She decided to tidy up, needing a simple task to occupy her hands and mind. She swept the floor, straightened the blankets on her cot, and dusted the mantelpiece. On a small shelf near Weston's bed sat a few meager possessions: a sharpening stone, a spare box of cartridges, and a small, leather-bound notebook, its cover worn smooth with use. She picked it up, the leather cool and soft beneath her fingers. It felt like a trespass, an intrusion into the private world of a man who offered so little of himself. She knew she should put it back, but her curiosity was a powerful, insistent pull. She wanted, just for a moment, to understand the man who had saved her. With trembling fingers, she opened it. The pages were filled with a neat, compact script. It wasn't a journal, not in the way she understood it. It was more of a ledger, a record of a life lived in practical terms. There were lists of supplies, calculations of distances, notes on weather patterns, and crudely but accurately drawn maps of unfamiliar territories. It was the logbook of a man who moved constantly, a man who survived by careful observation and meticulous planning. She thumbed through the pages, a faint sense of disappointment settling over her. There was nothing personal here, nothing that revealed the man behind the stoic facade. It was just a book of facts and figures. She was about to close it when a page in the middle caught her eye. It was thicker than the others. Her heart gave a little jump. Carefully, she turned to that page. Pressed between two blank sheets was the wildflower. It was still vibrant, its twilight blue petals flattened but perfectly preserved. He hadn't thrown it away. He had taken her small, forgotten offering and saved it. He had placed it carefully within the pages of this book, this intensely private record of his life. It was a single spot of color, a delicate, fragile thing, resting amongst the harsh calculus of his survival. Clara sank onto the edge of his bed, her legs suddenly weak. She stared at the pressed flower, and something deep inside her shifted, a tectonic plate of fear and mistrust finally giving way. He was the silent cowboy, the man of stone, the formidable protector. But he was also a man who saw a wildflower on a table and thought it was worth keeping. He didn't speak of kindness, he simply acted it. He didn't speak of safety, he provided it. He didn't speak of seeing her, the person hiding behind the fear. But this small, preserved flower told her that he did. It was a whispered confession, more eloquent than any poem. She gently closed the notebook and placed it exactly where she had found it, her touch reverent. She went to the cabin door and looked out at the peaceful, sun-drenched canyon. This place, which had been a temporary shelter, a hiding spot, now felt different. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with unspoken meaning. The stone walls of the canyon no longer felt like a prison. They felt like arms, holding her safe. She thought of the men who were hunting her, of the long, lonely road that stretched behind her, and she had always assumed in front of her. The running was all she had known for so long. But as she stood there, listening to the quiet sounds of the canyon, a new, tentative thought began to form in her mind, fragile and beautiful like the wildflower. Maybe this was it. Maybe, after all this time, this could be a place to finally stop. The discovery of the pressed flower shifted something fundamental in the quiet canyon. It was as if a key had turned in a lock Clara hadn't even known was there. The safety she felt was no longer just about the physical protection of the high rock walls or the formidable presence of the man who had brought her there. It was a deeper, more fragile thing now, a nascent sense of belonging that was both terrifying and intoxicating. Life settled into a gentle, predictable rhythm. Her ankle, still tender, was now strong enough for her to walk without the crutch, and she began to take on a larger share of the daily chores. She helped June tend the small garden, her hands, once soft and unaccustomed to labor, growing calloused from pulling weeds and turning the soil. She learned to cook over the open hearth, turning their meager supplies into savory stews that filled the small cabin with a warm, comforting aroma. Weston remained a creature of silent routine. He would leave at dawn, sometimes with a rifle, sometimes with an axe, and return at dusk. His shoulders slumped with a weariness that went bone deep. He never spoke of where he went or what he did, but the results were always tangible: a fresh supply of firewood, a brace of rabbits for the pot, a newly reinforced section of the corral fence. He was a man who spoke with the labor of his hands, and Clara found herself listening, truly listening, for the first time in her life. She heard his care for her and June in the solid thud of his axe. She heard his vigilance in the quiet way he cleaned his rifle by the firelight each night. She heard his weariness in the deep sigh he would let out when he finally sat down at the table. The day's work done. He was the silent cowboy, but she was beginning to hear everything. The confession came on a night when the sky itself seemed to break open. A storm, which had been threatening all afternoon with a bruised and purple sky, finally descended upon the canyon with a primal fury. The wind howled through the narrow fissure at the canyon's entrance, a mournful, shrieking sound. Rain came down in solid, blinding sheets, drumming against the roof and walls of the cabin until it felt as though they were at the bottom of a raging river. Thunder, sharp and violent, cracked directly overhead. Each clap so loud it vibrated through the floorboards and rattled the tin cups on the shelf. June, who was usually a sound sleeper, had been woken by the first ferocious clap. She was now huddled on Weston's big bed, wrapped in a cocoon of blankets, with only the top of her head visible. Weston sat on the edge of the bed, his back to the room, murmuring to her in a low, soothing voice that was nearly lost in the din of the storm. Clara sat at the small table, her hands wrapped around a cup of warm chicory, watching the fire dance in the hearth. The flickering light cast huge, distorted shadows that writhed and leaped across the log walls. The storm outside was a mirror of the one that had raged inside her for as long as she could remember. She was safe in this small, sturdy cabin. But the fury of the world was just outside the door, a reminder that this peace was a fragile, temporary thing. After a long while, June's whimpers subsided, replaced by the soft, even breathing of sleep. Weston remained seated for a few moments more, his hand resting on the mound of blankets. Before he rose and came to the fire, he added another log, sending a shower of orange sparks up the chimney, then turned and looked at Clara. In the flickering firelight, the hard planes of his face were softened, and his eyes held a deep, reflective weariness. He didn't speak, but his gaze was a question. It wasn't an intrusive one. It was simply an acknowledgement of her presence, an invitation to share the silence. And in that moment, with the storm raging around them and the innocent child sleeping safely just feet away, Clara knew it was time. She could no longer bear the weight of her secrets alone. The fragile trust that had grown between them, nurtured by quiet gestures and unspoken understanding, demanded something more. It demanded the truth. "They call him Silas," she began, her voice barely a whisper, a stark contrast to the roar of the storm. She didn't look at him, but stared into the mesmerizing heart of the fire. "The man on the train, he works for another man, a Mr. Thorne." She paused, gathering her courage. To speak these names aloud felt like a betrayal of the safety she had found here, like inviting the wolves into the fold. "Thorne owns a town, or he might as well, owns the saloon, the hotel, the general store. He holds the mortgage on nearly every ranch and farm for 50 miles in every direction." Weston moved from the hearth and sat down in the chair opposite her. He didn't speak, just sat and listened, his stillness a comforting, solid presence in the chaotic night. "My father, he had a small piece of land," Clara continued, her voice trembling slightly. "It wasn't much, but it was all we had after my mother passed. He wasn't a strong man. He liked to drink. He owed Thorne a great deal of money." She took a shaky breath. the shame of it a hot coal in her throat. Thorn has no family. He is an older man. He wanted a wife. My father saw a way to clear his debts. An arrangement was made. She finally risked a glance at him. His face was impassive, carved from shadow and light, but his eyes were fixed on her, his attention absolute. There was no judgment in his gaze, only a profound, unwavering focus. It gave her the strength to go on. I was part of the bargain. My father told me I was to be married. He spoke of it as a grand opportunity. He didn't use the word sold, but that is what it was. I was to be the final payment on his land. The wind shrieked, and a fresh torrent of rain hammered against the roof. I ran, she said simply. The night before the wedding was to take place, but I couldn't just leave. Thorn. He wasn't just cheating my father. He was cheating everyone. He kept 2 sets of books, one for the public and one for himself. He falsified deeds, forged signatures, charged interest rates that were impossible to pay. He was stealing the land from families who had worked it for generations, all under the color of law. The proof, it was in his office safe. I took it. She finally looked down at the tattered pouch, which she had repaired and now kept by her side at all times. This is my burden now. It's not just my freedom I was running for, it's theirs. All those people who don't even know they're being robbed. If I can get these papers to the territorial marshal in Carson City, it might be enough. It might stop him. She fell silent. Her story was told. The ugly, shameful truth of it lay bare in the small, warm room. She felt hollowed out, exposed. She waited for his reaction, for disgust, for pity, or worse, for the cold, practical assessment that she was more trouble than she was worth. Weston was silent for a long time. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the dying rumble of the storm, which was finally beginning to move on. He just sat there, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze lost in the flames. Then he rose. He didn't speak. He walked over to a large wooden chest in the corner and lifted the lid. He rummaged inside for a moment before pulling out a thick, woolen blanket. He walked back to her and draped it gently over her shoulders. She had been shivering, though she hadn't realized it until the warmth of the wool enveloped her. It was a simple, practical gesture, an answer to a need she hadn't even voiced. He returned to his side of the hearth, but he didn't sit down. He reached into the pocket of his worn denim trousers and pulled something out. He came back to the table and stood before her, his large frame blocking the firelight. He held out his hand, palm up. Resting in the center of his calloused palm was a coin. It was old, a silver dollar, its surface worn smooth with time and touch. The date and the image of Lady Liberty were faded, almost ghost-like. It was a coin that had clearly been carried for a very long time, its metallic coolness warmed by the heat of his body. He took her hand, his fingers rough but surprisingly gentle against her skin, and turned it over. He placed the coin in her palm and closed her fingers around it. The weight of it was solid, real. He finally met her eyes, and in their depths, she saw not pity, but a deep, shared darkness, a quiet landscape of loss. "I've had everything taken from me, too," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur, barely audible above the sound of the dripping rain. And that was all. He didn't tell his story. He didn't offer details. He simply offered her a single, perfect sentence of communion. He built a bridge between their 2 solitary islands of pain with 4 small words and a worn silver dollar. Clara looked down at the coin in her hand, its weight a strange comfort. The warmth of the blanket was on her shoulders. The storm had passed, and for the first time in a very long time, she did not feel like she was carrying her burden alone. The peace of the canyon was a fragile thing, Clara learned, as delicate as the wings of a butterfly. It could be shattered by something as small as a sound. The morning had dawned clear and cold, the sky a pale, flawless blue. A sense of normalcy, so long a stranger to her, had begun to feel like a familiar guest. She was humming a half-forgotten tune as she kneaded dough for the morning's bread. The rhythmic motion, a comforting meditation. Outside, June was chattering to a horned lizard she had cornered near the woodpile. Her high, happy voice, a bright thread in the quiet tapestry of the morning. It was Weston who heard it first. He was sharpening an axe head on a whetstone, the rhythmic shing 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 of steel on stone, a part of the morning's music. Suddenly, the sound stopped. Clara looked up. He was frozen, his head cocked, his body utterly still. His gaze was not on his work, but on the narrow entrance to the canyon. "What is it?" she asked, her hands stilling in the dough. He didn't answer immediately. He was listening, not just with his ears, but with his whole body, to a language she did not understand. "A shod horse on loose rock," he said finally. His voice a low, flat whisper that sent a bolt of ice through her veins. More than one. The fragile piece shattered into a million pieces. June Weston's voice was no longer soft. It was the crack of a whip. Inside, now. The little girl, startled by his tone, scrambled to her feet and ran into the cabin, her eyes wide with fear. "Under the bed," he commanded, not looking at her. His eyes were still fixed on the canyon mouth. "Don't make a sound until I tell you." He moved with a speed and economy of motion that was terrifying. The half-sharpened axe was forgotten. In his hand, as if it had always been there, was his revolver. He grabbed the rifle that leaned against the cabin wall and thrust it at Clara. "Do you know how to use this?" She stared at the heavy weapon, her mind a numb buzz of panic. "My father, he showed me once, a long time ago." "Good enough," he grunted. "Stay inside. Bar the door. Don't open it for anyone but me. Don't fire unless they break it down. Aim for the chest." He didn't wait for a reply. He was already moving, not towards the cover of the cabin, but away from it, melting into the shadows of the boulders that littered the canyon floor near the spring. He was drawing the threat away from them, making himself the target. Clara's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the rifle. She ran inside, her heart a wild, frantic drum against her ribs. She saw June's small, bare feet sticking out from under the bed. She wanted to run to her, to whisper words of comfort, but there was no time. She slammed the heavy wooden bar across the door. Its solid thump, a pathetic sound against the vast, waiting silence. She ran to the single small window, peering through a crack in the shutter. They came out of the aspens at the canyon's entrance, just as Weston had predicted. 4 riders, and leading them, his greasy bowler hat perched on his head and a cruel sneer on his face, was Silas. He had a rifle laid across his saddle horn. The other 3 were hard-faced men she didn't recognize, each armed and moving with the predatory confidence of wolves closing in on a kill. They reined in their horses in the center of the clearing, their presence a violent violation of the tranquil space. Their horses stamped and snorted, the jingle of their harnesses an obscenely loud sound in the stillness. "Well now," Cowboy Silas called out, his voice oily and loud, echoing off the rock walls. "This is a right cozy little spot you've got here. A man could almost forget the world. But we've come to remind you." He scanned the clearing, his eyes finally settling on the cabin. "And we've come for what you're hiding." There was no answer from the rocks. Silas chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "No need to be shy. We know she's in there. We tracked you all the way from the trestle. Took some time. But Mr. Thorne is a patient man when it comes to his property." One of the other men dismounted, uncoiling a rope from his saddle. "We gonna burn him out, Silas." "All in good time," Silas said, his eyes still roaming the rocks, searching. "First, let's see if our friend wants to be reasonable." He raised his voice again. "Send out the girl, and we'll just take you. Fight, and we'll take you both, and burn this little homestead to the ground. The child, too." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. From under the bed came a small, terrified whimper. The explosion. When it came, was so sudden and so loud it made Clara cry out. It wasn't the deep boom of Weston's rifle. It was the sharper crack of his revolver. One of the riders grunted and toppled from his saddle, a dark stain blossoming on his shoulder. All hell broke loose. The remaining 3 men scattered, diving from their horses and scrambling for cover. Silas leaped behind the water trough, firing his rifle blindly towards the rocks. Bullets ricocheted off the stone with angry, whining shrieks. Wood splintered from the corner of the cabin, just inches from the window where Clara was hiding. She saw Weston move, a fleeting ghost-like shadow dashing from one boulder to another, firing his revolver with a calm, deadly precision. Another man cried out, clutching his leg, and dragged himself behind a juniper bush. 2 down, 2 to go, but Weston was now pinned down. Silas and the remaining man had him trapped, laying down a steady, covering fire that chipped away at the rock he was hiding behind. Then, the unthinkable happened. The 4th man, the one who had been dragging himself, was not as badly wounded as he seemed. While the others kept Weston busy, he circled around, using the garden patch as cover. He rose up from behind the bean poles, a heavy piece of firewood clutched in his hand like a club. Weston was focused on Silas. He never saw the man coming. "Weston, behind you!" Clara screamed, but her voice was lost in the cacophony of gunfire. The man brought the club down in a vicious, arching blow. It connected with Weston's head with a sickening, wet crunch. Weston's body went limp. He didn't fall so much as collapse, folding in on himself like a puppet with its strings cut. He lay still, face down in the dust. "No," Clara whispered, her voice catching in her throat. The world seemed to slow down, the frantic sounds of the gunfight fading to a dull roar in her ears. She saw Silas and the other man rise from their cover, advancing cautiously on Weston's unmoving form. They had won. It was over. And in that moment, the old, familiar instinct screamed at her. Run! There was a back window. She could climb out, scramble up the rocks at the back of the canyon. She had done it before. She was a runner. That was how she survived. She took a step back from the window, her body already turning, but then she stopped. Her eyes fell on the small, bare feet sticking out from under the bed. She heard another tiny, choked sob. Running meant leaving June to them. Running meant leaving Weston's body to be desecrated by these ghouls. She looked around the small, warm cabin. She saw the prairie crowns June had made, hanging from a peg on the wall. She saw the worn spot on the floor where Weston sat each night, his quiet presence a solid, comforting weight. She saw the life they had built here, a fragile, beautiful thing, about to be extinguished. Running had been her life. But this canyon, this had become a life worth not running from. A new feeling, hot and fierce, burned through the icy terror. It was rage, pure, unadulterated rage. She turned back to the window. Weston's rifle lay on the floor where he had thrust it at her. It looked impossibly large and heavy. Her hands, slick with a cold sweat, fumbled with the weapon. She remembered her father's words from a lifetime ago. Brace it against your shoulder, girl, tight, or it'll knock you flat. Squeeze the trigger, don't pull it. She pushed the barrel of the rifle through the crack in the shutter. Silas and the other man were standing over Weston now, laughing. Silas nudged Weston's body with the toe of his boot. Not so tough now, are you, cowboy? He sneered. Clara took a deep, shuddering breath. She lined up the sights, not on Silas, but on the wooden water trough just beside him. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle exploded against her shoulder with a force that felt like a mule kick, knocking her back a step. The roar of the shot was deafening in the enclosed space. Her ears rang, but through the window, she saw the result. A hole the size of a fist blew out the side of the water trough, sending a geyser of water and splinters into the air. Silas and his man yelled in shock, spinning around, their eyes fixed on the cabin. The wounded man by the junipers, who had been struggling to his feet, froze. They had forgotten about her. They had dismissed her. Clara levered another round into the chamber. The metallic shuck-shuck of the action, a brutal, decisive sound. She rested the barrel on the window frame to steady her shaking hands. "Get off this land," she called out, her voice raw and shaking, but carrying across the clearing with a surprising force. Silas stared at the cabin, his face a mask of disbelief, which quickly curdled into fury. "It's the girl, the little rabbit has teeth. He raised his own rifle. You'll pay for that." But his companion was more cautious. "Silas, she's got a rifle and she's got cover. Weston might have another gun in there." Their hesitation was only a moment, but it was the moment that changed everything. Because behind them, a ghost was rising from the dust. Weston pushed himself up onto one knee. His face was a bloody mask, a deep gash on the side of his head pouring blood down into his eyes. He was swaying, his movements unsteady, but he was alive, and in his hand was the revolver he had not let go of even in unconsciousness. He fired. The shot was wild, kicking up dust at the feet of the unwounded man, but it was enough. The man yelped and scrambled back, his nerve broken. Now they were caught, a rifle in front, a revolver behind. "You," Silas snarled, turning his attention back to Weston. "You're supposed to be dead." "Not yet," Weston rasped, his voice a gravelly ruin. He staggered to his feet, a terrifying, bloody apparition. He lunged forward, not with speed, but with a single-minded, unstoppable force. He ignored Silas and tackled the other man, driving him to the ground with the full weight of his body. The man's rifle flew from his hands. Silas, seeing his advantage gone, made his choice. He turned and fired a last, panicked shot towards the cabin, then ran for his horse. The wounded man by the junipers was already dragging himself towards his own mount. Weston, breathing heavily, got to his feet. He picked up the fallen man's rifle. He and Clara now stood, 50 yards apart, 2 points of a triangle of defiance. The last man, seeing Silas flee and finding himself facing down 2 rifles, threw his hands in the air. I'm out of it," he yelled, and scrambled away, half running, half crawling, towards the mouth of the canyon. Silas was already on his horse, galloping away. He paused at the edge of the trees to look back, his face contorted with hate. "This ain't over." "Cowboy," he screamed. "Thorne will send an army for you." Then he was gone. The sudden silence was deafening. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the coppery scent of blood. The clearing was a wreck of overturned buckets, startled horses, and the still form of the first man Weston had shot. Clara lowered the rifle, its weight suddenly unbearable. Her arms felt like lead. The strength that had filled her, the rage that had fueled her, drained away, leaving her weak and trembling. She watched as Weston took a few unsteady steps towards the cabin. His face was pale beneath the blood. His eyes found hers across the clearing, and, for a moment, there was a look of something she couldn't name: pride, gratitude, awe. Then his eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed, face first, into the dust. He did not move again. For a heartbeat, the world was silent and still. The gunpowder smoke hung in the air, a foul, hazy curtain. The only movement was a gentle breeze stirring the leaves of the willows, indifferent to the carnage it surveyed. Then sound and motion returned with a rush. Weston. The name was torn from Clara's throat, a raw, ragged sound of pure terror. She dropped the heavy rifle, its clatter on the floorboards an insignificant noise, and fumbled with the bar on the door. It felt impossibly heavy. Her hands were shaking too violently, her muscles refusing to obey. Finally, it scraped back, and she threw the door open, stumbling out into the devastated clearing. He was just a heap of dusty clothes and blood, unmoving. A primal fear, colder and sharper than any she had felt before, seized her. She ran to him, her own mended ankles screaming in protest, and fell to her knees at his side. "Weston, please," she begged, her hand hovering over his back, afraid to touch him, afraid of what she might find. "Please, wake up." His breathing was a faint, shallow whisper of air against the dust, but he was alive. Relief, so fierce and overwhelming it was almost painful, washed over her, but it was followed immediately by the crushing weight of their reality. She was alone. June was still hiding in the cabin. The men who had fled could come back, and the man who had been her shield, her protector, was broken at her feet. She knew she had to get him inside. The thought was absurd. He was a mountain of a man. She was a slight, half-starved girl, but the alternative, leaving him exposed in the dirt, was unthinkable. She hooked her arms under his, planting her feet, and pulled with every ounce of strength she possessed. He was dead weight. She managed to move him only a few inches, a pathetic, scraping trail in the dust. Tears of frustration and despair welled in her eyes. "I can't," she sobbed to the empty canyon. "I can't do it." From the cabin door, a small voice said, "I can help." Clara looked up. June stood there, her small face pale and tear-streaked, but her expression was one of grim determination. She had pulled a small, three-legged stool to the doorway and was dragging it across the clearing. "We can roll him," she said, her voice a reedy imitation of Weston's own practical tone. And so began their impossible, desperate task. They pushed and pulled, using the stool as a lever, their bare hands for purchase. They were too small, determined figures fighting against the sheer, unyielding physics of an unconscious man. It was a slow, agonizing process, measured in inches. They strained until their muscles screamed, until their breath came in ragged, burning gasps. Clara's world narrowed to this single, all-consuming effort moving the mountain. He was no longer her protector. He was her responsibility, her burden, and she would not fail him. It took them the better part of an hour to drag him into the cabin. They collapsed onto the floor beside him, their chests heaving, their bodies slick with sweat and streaked with his blood. The long vigil began. Clara, with June as her small, silent assistant, cleaned the gash on his head. It was deep and ugly, a brutal wound that had bled profusely. She washed it as best she could with water from the spring and bound it tightly with strips of cloth torn from her own petticoat. She cleaned the blood from his face, revealing the stark, pale skin beneath. His face, which had always been a mask of stoic hardness, looked young and terribly vulnerable in repose. The grim line of his mouth was softened, and the lines of weariness around his eyes seemed to have been smoothed away, leaving only a deep, unsettling stillness. She sat by his cot through the first long night, watching the rise and fall of his chest, a movement so slight she often found herself leaning close, her own breath held, just to be sure he was still with her. The silence of the cabin was a living thing, a stark contrast to the storm-filled night of her confession. This silence was not peaceful. It was a predator, waiting. Every rustle of leaves outside, every hoot of a distant owl, sent a fresh jolt of fear through her. She kept the rifle on the floor beside her, its cold weight a poor substitute for the steady, living presence of the man in the bed. Sometime before dawn, she must have drifted off, her head slumped on the edge of the cot. She was woken by a small, gentle touch on her shoulder. June stood beside her, her eyes large in the gray light. In her hand, she held a single, perfect wildflower, the same twilight blue as the one Clara had picked by the spring. "For the table," June whispered, as if afraid to wake him, to make it nice. She placed the flower in a cup of water on the table, a small, brave offering of life and beauty in a room thick with the scent of fear and impending loss. And so the rhythm of their days was set. Each morning, June would venture out and return with a new wildflower for the cup on the table. It was her daily ritual, her prayer. Clara, in turn, devoted herself to Weston. She bathed his face with cool water. She forced sips of broth between his slack lips, praying that some of it would find its way down. She changed the bandages on his head, her stomach clenching each time at the sight of the angry, healing wound. She talked to him. At first, it was just whispers. "You have to wake up. Weston, June needs you. She could never finish the thought. But as the days bled into one another, a week turning into two, her whispers grew into a steady, one-sided conversation. She told him about her day, about the rabbit she had failed to snare, about the new prairie crown she and June had made. She filled the terrifying silence with the sound of her own voice, hoping it might act as a lifeline, a thread he could follow back from whatever dark, silent place he had gone. One afternoon, the sky outside a brilliant, cloudless blue. The silence in the cabin felt particularly oppressive. Weston's breathing was still shallow, his stillness absolute. A wave of despair, cold and heavy, washed over Clara. He was fading. She could feel it. She was losing him. Her eyes fell on his small, leather-bound notebook, still sitting on the shelf. She needed something, anything, to anchor her. She took the book and sat by his cot, opening it to the page where her wildflower was still pressed. She gently traced the outline of a delicate petal. It was a memory of a day when hope had seemed possible. She turned the pages, not really reading, just letting the sight of his neat, practical script fill her vision. Tucked into a small pocket on the inside back cover was a thin, worn book. It was not his. The cover was soft, faded buckram, and the title was barely visible, Leaves of Grass. She opened it. The poems were strange, sprawling things, full of a wild, passionate love for the world, for the land, for life itself. She had no idea how it had come to be in his possession. It seemed so at odds with the silent, guarded man she knew. Her fingers stopped on a line. "I am the man. I suffered. I was there." Without thinking, she began to read aloud. Her voice was soft at first, hesitant, but it gained strength as she continued. She read of the open road, of the songs of birds, of the simple, profound beauty of the world. She read not for herself, but for him. She poured all of her fear, all of her desperate hope, into the cadence of the words, weaving a blanket of sound to wrap around him. "The spotted hawk swoops by and accuses me. He complains of my gab and my loitering. I too am not a bit tamed. I too am untranslatable. I sound my barbaric yawp over the roofs of the world." She was so lost in the words, in the act of reading, that she didn't notice the change at first. It was a subtle thing, a flicker of his eyelids, a slight tensing of the fingers on his right hand, which lay limp on the blanket. She stopped reading, her heart suddenly pounding. "Weston," she whispered. His eyelids fluttered again. Then, slowly, agonizingly, they opened. His eyes were cloudy at first, unfocused, as he struggled to surface from the deep, dark water of his unconsciousness. They roamed the cabin, taking in the log ceiling, the cold hearth, the cup of wildflowers on the table. Finally, they found her. They cleared, and the familiar slate-gray intensity she knew so well locked with her own. He was back. A sob of pure, unadulterated relief escaped her. Tears she hadn't even known she was holding back began to stream down her face. He tried to speak, but his voice was a dry, rasping croak. He swallowed, and tried again. "Water," he whispered. She practically flew to the bucket, her hands shaking as she filled a dipper and brought it to his lips. He drank greedily, his eyes never leaving her face. She helped him lie back, her touch gentle, reverent. They looked at each other for a long, silent moment. The air was thick with everything that had happened, everything that had passed between them while he was gone. She had seen him at his most vulnerable. She had tended to his broken body. She had poured her secret heart out to his sleeping form. The intimacy was overwhelming, and with it came a sudden, sharp stab of shame. He was a stranger, and she had trespassed. "You don't know me," she said, the words a quiet, aching confession. It was not an accusation. but a statement of fact, a sudden, panicked need to put the wall back up between them. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. His gaze held a depth of understanding that went far beyond the words she had spoken. He seemed to see all the nights she had sat by his side, all the fear she had carried, all the hope she had clung to. He slowly raised his hand, the one that had been clenched on the blanket. His movements were weak, but deliberate. He uncurled his fingers. Resting in his palm, fragile and faded, was the pressed wildflower from his notebook. She stared at it, her breath catching in her throat. She had found it, days ago, in a moment of despair. She had taken it from the book and pressed it into his unfeeling hand, a silent, desperate plea to the universe, a talisman to guide him home. He had held it, through all the darkness. He had held on to it. He met her tear-filled gaze. His voice was still a rough whisper, but it was steady, and it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. "No," he said, "but I'm starting to—" His return to the world was not a sudden flood, but a slow, arduous tide. The first few days after he woke were a landscape of pain and profound weakness. He would drift in and out of a fevered sleep, his moments of lucidity brief and clouded. In those moments, Clara was a constant, steady presence at his side. She was the cool cloth on his forehead, the spoonful of broth at his lips, the quiet voice that anchored him to the log walls of the cabin and the slice of blue sky in the window. He was a difficult patient. The stillness that was his nature had been a sign of strength. The stillness of a convalescent was a cage he fought against with a silent, simmering fury. The first time he tried to stand, he made it halfway to his feet before the world tilted violently, and he collapsed back onto the cot, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat. He did not speak a word, but Clara saw the raw frustration in his eyes, the deep humiliation of a strong man laid low. She simply helped him lie back, adjusted his blankets, and said nothing. She was learning that his silence had many shades, and this one was sharp with self-recrimination. But slowly, painstakingly, the tide turned. The color began to return to his face. The long, sleeping hours grew shorter, replaced by long hours of quiet, wakeful observation. He would watch her as she moved about the cabin, her steps now confident and sure. He watched her with June, their heads bent together over a prairie crown, their soft laughter a sound that had been absent from this canyon for too long. He watched, and in his watching, Clara felt a subtle shift. He was no longer just a patient, and she his nurse. He was a man, seeing the woman who had saved his life, the woman who had held his small world together while he was gone. The day he finally stood, leaning heavily on the crutch he had fashioned from a sturdy aspen branch, was a victory for all of them. June clapped her small hands in delight. Clara felt a surge of relief so powerful it made her knees weak. His recovery meant their chances of survival had just improved tenfold. But it was more than that. Seeing him upright, a tall, if unsteady, figure once more, felt like the sun breaking through after a long, dark winter. The ranch began to heal alongside him. The memory of the gunfight was a scar on the landscape bullet holes in the cabin walls, a splintered water trough, a patch of dark, disturbed earth where a man had fallen. But life, stubborn and persistent, was reasserting itself. Weston, with a grim determination that bordered on foolishness, refused to be idle. One morning, Clara came out to find him perched precariously on a ladder, a hammer in his hand, trying to mend the section of the roof where a stray bullet had damaged the shingles. He was clumsy, his movements hampered by the crutch he had propped against the wall and the lingering dizziness from his head wound. "Weston, you'll fall," she cried, her heart leaping into her throat. He didn't look down. "Roof's got a hole," he stated, as if it were the simplest, most obvious fact in the world. "Winter's coming." She knew arguing was useless. Instead, she stood at the bottom of the ladder. Her hands clenched and became his second set of hands. She passed him shingles, She held the nails. She steadied the ladder when he shifted his weight. They worked in a shared, anxious silence. The only sounds the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of his hammer and the whisper of the wind through the pines. He did not thank her, but when he was finally done and stood safely on the ground, leaning on his crutch and wiping sweat from his brow, he looked at her. His gaze was direct and held a quiet acknowledgement that was more meaningful than any words of gratitude. They were a partnership now, forged in crisis, tempered in the quiet labor of rebuilding. Clara, in turn, found her own rhythms. She was no longer a refugee, a transient figure of fear. She was a woman with a home, and she tended to it with a fierce, protective love. One afternoon, as Weston worked to repair the corral fence, she was hanging June's small, patched dresses to dry on a line she had strung between two fence posts. The sun was warm on her back, and a gentle breeze billowed the colorful fabrics. She looked at the scene, the sturdy cabin, the smoke curling from the chimney, the little girl chasing butterflies in the meadow, the tall, quiet man patiently mending what was broken. Her heart ached with a feeling she couldn't name, a beautiful, painful mix of joy and terror. She had never known a feeling like it. This was what it meant to have something to lose. She was no longer running from a life she didn't want. She was standing her ground for a life she was terrified of losing. I am no longer a person who runs, she thought, the realization settling deep in her bones. I am a person who chooses to stay. The unspoken threat of Silas and his employer, Thorn, was a constant shadow at the edge of their peaceful existence. They never spoke of it, but it was there in the way Weston's eyes would scan the canyon entrance each morning, in the way he always kept his rifle close at hand, even when weeding the garden. They were living on borrowed time, in a small, stolen pocket of peace, and this knowledge gave every quiet moment a precious, bittersweet intensity. The day it happened was a day like any other, which was perhaps why it felt so profound. The late afternoon sun was slanting across the canyon, bathing everything in a soft, golden light. The heat of the day was beginning to break. Weston had spent the afternoon finishing the repairs on the water trough, and Clara had been weeding the garden until her back ached. They were both dusty, tired, and thirsty. They met at the newly mended trough, which was once again filled to the brim with cold, clear water from the spring. June was a short distance away, talking quietly to Dust Devil, the big roan horse Weston had finally brought down from the high pasture. Without a word, Weston dipped a tin cup into the trough and passed it to Clara. She drank deeply, the water shockingly cold and clean. She passed the cup back to him, and he drank as well, his throat working. They stood in a comfortable silence, the silence of two people who had labored side by side and now shared in a simple, well-earned rest. The only sounds were the gentle trickle of water, the buzz of insects, and the murmur of June's voice talking to the horse. Clara leaned against the rough-hewn wood of the trough, a deep, weary contentment settling over her. She watched Weston as he stared out at the canyon wall, his profile strong and quiet against the golden light. He was still thin, and the scar on his head was a stark, pale line against his tanned skin. But the strength was returning to him, a slow, steady tide. He must have felt her gaze, because he turned his head and looked at her, and he didn't look away. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held hers, and in their depths, she saw a universe of things he would never say. She saw the memory of the gunfight, the long darkness of his sleep, the sight of her sitting by his bed. She saw the quiet afternoons, the shared meals, the silent partnership. He was looking at her as if seeing her for the very first time, and at the same time, as if he had known her his entire life. He set the cup down on the edge of the trough. He didn't speak. He slowly raised his hand, the one that had held the pressed wildflower. He reached out and, with a touch so gentle it was barely there, he laid 2 fingers against her cheek. His skin was rough, calloused, but his touch was feather-light. His gaze was intent, searching, as if he were memorizing the lines of her face. Then his thumb moved. It traced a slow, deliberate path from her cheekbone to the corner of her mouth, finally coming to rest, ever so lightly, on her bottom lip. The touch was an earthquake. It sent a tremor through her entire body, a jolt of heat and light that stole the air from her lungs. It was not a prelude to a kiss. It was something else, something far more intimate. It was a question. It was a discovery. It was an acknowledgement. He looked into her eyes, his own dark with a raw, unguarded emotion she had never seen in him before. And then he spoke, his voice a low, rough whisper that was meant only for her. "Now I know you." The words were simple, but they landed with the force of a revelation. He didn't say he was grateful. He didn't say he cared for her. He said he knew her. He had seen past the frightened runaway, past the desperate girl clutching her secrets. He had seen the woman who had stood her ground, who had fought for him, who had nursed him, who hung a child's laundry in the sun and made a home out of nothing but dust and determination. He saw her. A slow, tremulous smile touched her lips, the ones his thumb was still gently gracing. A single, hot tear escaped her eye and traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She just stood there, held captive by his touch and his gaze, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. He already knew. The weeks that followed were a quiet lesson in the architecture of a new life. They were building something, not with logs and nails, but with shared silences, small labors, and the unspoken understanding that had grown between them. The canyon was no longer a hiding place. It was a home. The ever-present threat of Thorn and his men was a distant cloud on a far horizon, a possibility they acknowledged with vigilance but refused to let poison the precious, sun-drenched present. They found their way to the high meadow just outside the canyon's fissure by accident. Weston, his strength almost fully returned, had been tracking a deer, and Clara and June had followed. They emerged from the narrow rock passage into a world of breathtaking openness. It was a vast, sloping sea of grama grass and sage, dotted with clusters of pinon pine and juniper. In the distance, the red rock formations of the desert burned under a sky so immense it felt like a benediction. It was a place that made you feel both infinitesimally small and connected to everything. It became their church. They would go there in the late afternoons, when the heat of the day had broken and the world was bathed in a honeyed, golden light. It was on one such afternoon that the story found its ending, or perhaps its true beginning. The sun was a great, molten orb, beginning its slow, majestic descent towards the jagged teeth of the western mountains. It painted the underside of the few scattered clouds in impossible shades of rose and fiery orange. The air was still and warm, and smelled of dust, pine, and the coming cool of the desert night. Weston sat on a large, flat-topped boulder, his back resting against a gnarled pinon pine. His crutch lay forgotten in the grass beside him. He was no longer the pale, broken man from the cabin. The sun and the hard work of his recovery had etched the lines of strength back into his face. He sat with his familiar stillness, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was not the guarded stillness of a man on watch, but the deep, contented stillness of a man at peace in his own territory. A short distance away, June, her laughter like the chiming of a tiny bell, was trying to coax a kid a small, white goat they had acquired from a traveling prospector in exchange for a side of venison to eat a flower. The goat, whose name changed daily according to June's whims, would nibble the offering and then bound away, prompting another round of delighted pursuit. They were a small, perfect portrait of innocence, a moving part of the vast, silent landscape. Clara sat on the rock beside Weston, so close that their shoulders brushed. She had been leaning against him for some time, the solid warmth of his body a comforting, living anchor. She had given up trying to understand the feeling that bloomed in her chest whenever she was near him. It was a complex, tangled thing, a deep, resonant gratitude, a fierce protectiveness, and a quiet, terrifying joy. It was enough, for now, just to feel it. She watched June's carefree dance, and a wave of emotion, so powerful it almost took her breath away, washed over her. She thought of the girl she had been, the one who had tumbled, terrified and alone, into the back of a freight car. That girl felt like a ghost, a character from a story someone else had told her. She had been running from a name, a fate that had been chosen for her. But here, in this quiet wilderness, she had been stripped of everything but the essential truth of who she was, and she had found that it was enough. "I have nothing left to hide," she said, her voice soft, barely disturbing the immense quiet. She didn't look at him, but kept her gaze on the setting sun, on the small, joyful figure of the child in the distance. "Nothing except my real name, but I'm not sure it even matters anymore." The name Abigail felt like a dress she had outgrown, the property of a girl who no longer existed. She was not Abigail, the bartered bride. She was Clara, the woman who had fought and healed and built a home, or maybe she was just her, a woman without a name, defined only by the life she was living, here and now. Weston was silent for a long time. The only sound was the sigh of the evening breeze through the pines. She felt the slight shift of his weight as he turned his head to look at her. He did not touch her, but she could feel the intensity of his gaze, a palpable warmth on the side of her face. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, rough murmur, the sound of stones shifting in a deep riverbed. "It matters," he said. "It matters if you say it while you're staying." The words were a quiet thunderclap in her heart. He was not asking a question. He was laying out the terms of a new world, a world where her past was not a thing to be discarded, but a gift to be offered, a final, intimate piece of herself to be shared within the sacred bounds of a shared future. He was telling her that her name, her true name, was the key to a door she would only unlock if she had no intention of ever leaving. She turned her head then, her cheek brushing against the rough fabric of his shirt. She looked into his eyes. They were dark in the fading light, shadowed and deep, and in them she saw the reflection of the sunset, of the wide-open sky, of herself. She saw a future, as vast and as full of terrifying, beautiful promise as the landscape that surrounded them. A slow smile touched her lips. It was the same tremulous, tear-filled smile he had seen at the water trough, but this time it was steady. It was certain. "Do you know me yet?" she whispered, the question a playful echo of their past, a final, gentle test. He raised his hand, his movements as slow and deliberate as the setting sun. He did not touch her cheek this time. His thumb came to rest directly on her lips, a gesture of profound intimacy and possession that was as soft as a breath. He held her gaze, his own eyes dark with an emotion so deep it needed no name. He leaned a fraction closer, his whisper a warm caress against her skin. "Not yet," he said, "but I will, every day, if you let me." And in the vast, quiet church of the wilderness, as the last sliver of the sun bled away behind the mountains and the first star pricked the deep, velvet curtain of the night, he sealed his unspoken promise, a vow to spend a lifetime learning the language of her heart. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. To help us bring you more tales from the frontier, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like, and if you really enjoyed it, consider hitting that hype button to help this story reach more listeners just like you.